Hi there. So today I'd like to discuss the differences between LGA socketed CPUs and PGA socketed CPUs. PGA being the type of CPU I'm holding right here. This is an AMD Semprom from about 2006 or 5 or something, 5. Anyway, point is that this CPU is using what we call a PGA style of chip, which is pin grid array. So as you can see, all the pins are mounted onto the bottom of the central processor. This then goes into a zero insertion force socket and is clamped down with a tension arm, and then your CPU is ready to accept any sort of heatsink or other potential cooling options, and you're good to go. Whereas with an LGA CPU, it's a very similar style, except these pins have been replaced with pads that are flat against the CPU, and then that CPU goes into a socket which has a series of pins inside of it that make contact with the CPU. You apply your tension arms, and then again you're ready to install your cooling solution. Now when it comes down to the durability of PGA versus LGA, I do have some comments, and also when it comes down to the whole pricing analysis of how you should handle certain repairs when certain circumstances are considered, I would like to discuss that as well. So first thing I'd like to make clear about PGA and its durability, I can drag my finger across this PGA chip, I can go fast, I can go slow, I can flick it, I can even tap the shit out of it, and what you'll notice is that I did cause some slight bends in some of the pins, as you can see, and that was with a lot of force. Now, whereas this would be absolutely detrimental to an LGA socket if anything were to happen like I just demonstrated, with a PGA chip, I can take this here screwdriver with a flathead, and I can go carefully in between these pins on the first row, or second row, wherever they've been screwed, and I can go in between them, and with very little effort and very little experience, get a feel for how they should move, and carefully bend all of the pins I just messed up in front of you back into place. Now you'll notice that even after I'm finished with this in a few seconds here, that it's not going to look the same as it's going to be obvious to anybody who looks at this CPU that the pins were at one point bent, and that the CPU has gone through some shit, but once all these pins are bent relatively straight back into place, like I've just finished doing, you'll notice that if you look at the general array of the pins, as opposed to the front face of the pins, that the pins at the bottom are actually just as in line with the grid as any of the pins in the center. So it looks like they're still a little bent, but if you actually look at the grid, this CPU will fit into a zero insertion force socket now with absolutely no trouble. I can drop it in and it will work. So even though you do take a bit of a risk having the pins exposed on the CPU, it's actually a very recoverable scenario, and chances are, no matter how badly you really mess up these pins, as long as they're still attached to the CPU and not bent straight down onto each other or straight down onto the printed circuit board, you will have no problem recovering a CPU from that sort of treatment and being able to reuse it in a socket. Oops, I just dropped it, but I bet you it'll still work. So with that said, like I said, the LGA socket does not have that sort of durability. If you do anything to the pins on the inside of an LGA socket, you are going to have 0 to next to 0 of a chance of actually fixing that socket by yourself. And that's due to a few things. The biggest difference I can imagine is that you notice here that the pins on the CPU go straight up and down, whereas the pins in an LGA socket are actually angled, and there's so many of them and so dense of a proximity that it's very hard to tell A, which pin you're looking at, B, whether or not that pin is at the proper height because of the way that they're all organized, and C, getting in between, say somewhere in the middle here, that's very easy to do with this screwdriver because I just drop it in the place I need to, bend it in the way I need to, and the pin will go back straight. Whereas with a pin in an LGA socket, because of the fact that they are not sticking straight up, getting under them, getting under the ones around them, and pulling the one back up to where it needs to be, or putting the bend back into it to make sure it makes proper contact with a certain pad and isn't shorting to the pin next to it, is almost, if not impossible. So now we're getting down to the price discussion versus PGA motherboards and LGA motherboards. And what I've noticed is that in the pricing of, say, AMD's newest line at the time of filming, Ryzen, they seem to have been able to produce PGA chips for PGA motherboards at a price that is lesser or equal to Intel's offerings with cheaper motherboards than Intel offers. So it's not costing the consumer anything more than an Intel chip would cost to get this PGA technology. And Intel often uses the LGA layout as an excuse to why motherboards cost more. So if AMD is able to make PGA chips that cost the same as Intel's, but Intel is saying that the motherboards cost more because they're making them use LGA, then my question is, why are the cost-saving measures by Intel that are being pushed onto the motherboard manufacturers for LGA not being passed to us by Intel? So the motherboard manufacturers are charging us more for LGA socket boards than they do for PGA boards, but Intel isn't charging us a discount for the CPU because it doesn't have PGA pins. So it seems like LGA is actually not giving you any price advantage. It's costing you more because let's take, for example, my personal desktop rig. My personal desktop rig is an i7 5820K socketed in an EVGA Micro 2 X99 motherboard. Unfortunately, with this current setup, I've gone through 3 iterations with my 5820K, both beforehand and a Sabertooth X99 motherboard, which is now comfortably resting under my bed because I have no idea whether or not it's going to kill another CPU because I've already gone through 2 with those motherboards. So I have no idea whether or not the problems being caused to my CPU that is causing them to die is BIOS related, motherboard pin grid array related, or simply just a fluke of bad luck where I've had 2 dead CPUs. However, PGA sockets give me a confidence that LGA sockets will never give me, which is that there is absolutely, if all of these pins are fitting into the PGA socket and all of these pins are being seated and the CPU is locking into place, I can say with confidence that as long as the system is turning on past that point, that my problems are not going to exist with the motherboard when it comes to my CPU. My problems are going to exist with the CPU unit itself. LGA does not provide me that level of security. If something goes wrong with a CPU in an LGA socket, I really don't have any way of knowing initially whether or not my problems are related to the socket itself or if they're related to the CPU that is in it. So with that being said, that's why there's currently a $500 motherboard that is laying under my bed with no confidence from me that it works properly. I cannot sell it to anybody. I cannot use it in another build because I have absolutely no idea whether or not it's going to kill the next CPU it put into it, like it did 2 of my other 5820Ks. Might I also mention that these CPUs worked fine in that system for anywhere between 2 months to a year. In both the motherboards I had prior, because the one I have now is technically an RMA, because the first time my CPU died mysteriously, I assumed that it could either be the CPU itself or possibly the motherboard. So I returned the motherboard and got an RMA as a replacement with a bent pin, which I bent back. It then worked, but again, it killed another CPU. So whether or not that's due to the pin grid array, whether or not that's due to just that particular motherboard in the BIOS, the point is that I don't know and I don't have confidence. So I had to buy a new motherboard, and that cost me $400. Now the CPU is valued at about $500. So if I'm going to spend $300 to $500 on a motherboard, I want confidence that if something goes wrong with my motherboard, that it's obvious, or my CPU rather, that it's obvious, and that I can say with confidence that yes, it's the CPU that is dead, or yes, it is the motherboard that is dead. And unfortunately, LGA does not provide me personally with a level of security that makes me confident out of first call judgment like that, like PGA does. So in my personal experience, would I rather replace the $450 component that keeps my system running or the $500 component that keeps my system running when the $500 component is this big and the $450-ish component is what everything else in my system is plugged into? I'd rather have reliance on the $450 component that everything is plugged into, and I'd rather ship them back this instead of ship them back the entire motherboard. So you're not saving on price. You're not getting a more stable platform. You're not getting a more durable platform. This is sort of an afterthought for the PGA LGA video that I forgot to mention. I do think that the PGA system does have some room for improvement. The one thing I would like to see that LGA has that PGA doesn't is it does have a retention bracket that holds in the CPU from the integrated heat spreader, and it does stop the potential hazard that exists with PGA CPUs, where if you pull the CPU out from the socket as opposed to twist the heat, or rather, if you pull off the heatsink from the CPU while the CPU is still in the socket and the thermal compound has become hard and crusty on the top of the die and they've fused themselves together, oftentimes what can happen is you pull the heatsink off and the CPU comes out with it, ripping it out of the socket. Now this can cause damage to the internals of the socket. This can cause damage to the pins of the CPU if you're not aware of it when you pull it out, and you can potentially set down the cooler with the CPU on the bottom of it, and in doing so, possibly damage those pins here on the bottom. So that would be one little thing that I'd like to see AMD do or Intel do, and I think that would be a nice happy medium between the two. By all accounts, I've just proven that LGA is less durable than PGA in 99% of scenarios. Unless, of course, you're using this as a coaster. If you're using this as a coaster, then in which case your LGA CPU coaster is probably going to be more durable than your PGA CPU coaster. But in the case of any actual real-world scenario, I would much rather put my reliance on these straight bendable pins than I would rather put it on those curved, impossible to work on pins. And you might call me a bit of a stickler if that's the case. You might call me unrealistic, but in my personal experience, LGA offers you absolutely no benefits and causes more problems than it's worth. And for some reason, even though it's supposed to save us money, it ends up costing us more, because AMD is able to make a CPU that competes with Intel in almost every single, if not better than their current offerings, with a PGA style, with motherboards that cost less. And in my question to you is, yes, it is more effort to remove your motherboard and ship it back. So if you only have about a $150 disparity between your motherboard and your CPU, what would you rather do? Would you rather spend 2 hours ripping out your entire motherboard to ship that back when you have a CPU failure, because you're not sure whether or not it's the CPU or the motherboard that failed, because there's really no way to tell on an LGA chipset? Or would you rather ship back your easy to identify central processor, because it clearly has bent pins and is no longer going up and down into that zero insertion force socket that it's supposed to? If it doesn't fall flat into the CPU socket and you're looking at it and there's no way you're going to be able to bend it back, you're fucked. And if your pins are like that in your LGA socket motherboard, that motherboard is fucked. So if your CPU's fucked, oh well, you got to buy a new CPU. You bent the pin and you're never going to be able to bend it back. Woe is you. You suck. However, if your motherboard is the one with the bent pin, well, all of that, and now you have to rebuild your entire computer. So, again, and it's going to cost you more to replace it if they don't honor the warranty, which 99% of motherboard manufacturers who see a bent pin are going to go, fuck you, buy a new board. So if that's the case, again, and Intel really held my hand while I was going through these problems, and they were gracious enough to provide me with 2 replacement 5820Ks when I was going through this problem. And they were totally understanding about it, because they realize that motherboard manufacturers, with LGA chipsets, again, I think that they realize that there is some level of uncertainty in the average consumer where their problem is stemming from when they have a CPU failure and are requesting an RMA. I think they understand that a lot of people are unsure if the cause is the CPU or the motherboard, and I think they also understand that most people do not have the resources to go and spend another $500 on a board just to test whether or not it's their central processor that failed or it's their motherboard. And in the case of an X99 enthusiast chipset motherboard, good luck picking one of those up for less than half the cost of your CPU. It's probably going to cost you at least half, if not double. Or if not the exact same amount, excuse me. And if you're rocking anything better than a 5820K, then maybe I can see your point. If you're spending above $1,000 on a CPU and you have a $500 part fail, it's much less of a pain in the butt. But again, the disparity like that with CPUs and PGA are greater. So you will end up probably spending anywhere between $250 to $350, maybe $500 if you want to get crazy, on an AMD Ryzen CPU, and it's going to be socketed in a top-of-the-line motherboard that costs you $175 to $220. And of course, that's a large price gap if you bought the $500 CPU and the $350 motherboard for it. However, when it comes down to LGA, especially the 2011 socket, you're easily going to spend the price of the CPU of the Ryzen CPU on the motherboard. The Ryzen CPU is going to cost you $500. The motherboard's going to cost you $500. Now, in that case, or in my case, because my 5820K costs about $500 when I bought it, would you rather have the motherboard die or the CPU die? When it's, $50 difference, $100 difference, $200 difference, I know I'd rather have confidence that, okay, something's wrong, it's CPU related, well, PGA. So chances are, not the motherboard, ship them back the CPU, oh, it was the CPU, problem solved, or, it was the motherboard, okay, we're fucked anyway, let's replace the motherboard. Whereas when it comes to the LGA style, you might as well just ship them back at the same time because you really won't know, at least in my experience. So, say what you want, but it seems like, to me, you're not saving money by going LGA. You're not saving yourself any headache by going LGA, and you're not giving yourself the opportunity to fix your mistakes when you go LGA. So that's my opinion. I think PGA is the way to go. I think PGA is the safer bet, and I think PGA makes the most sense for most amount of people who are not retarded and can actually use a screwdriver to bend back this grid. Because as you can see, this grid here is beautiful. It's not perfect, but it's beautiful, and it will fit in a zero insertion force socket, and it will work. But if you try to do the same things that I did to these pins in an LGA motherboard, you might as well throw it out because it's a piece of junk. Anyway, hopefully you can see my point of view. If you don't, I politely ask you to share your story, and if you feel like I actually have no basis to have this opinion, then I'm going to tell you to go fuck yourself, because I've gone through this for years, and like I said, PGA is the safer bet. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.